In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there are boundless horrors. There are extragalactic invaders who use all forms of life as means for food, to propagate their vicious and alien hive mind's only goal, to spread. There are ancient robotic remnants of an empire that had unimaginable power, awakening to a galaxy they believe they ought to rule, and whom possess technology beyond all of the modern races. There are those who roam the stars, seeking only whom they may raid and torture for their own amusement. And even humanity itself, which has persevered into this age of darkness, has created boundless horrors of its own. Worlds where millions or even billions of people live in squalor and abject destitution, feeding off of gruel, while others roam the galaxy seeking their destruction. And their empire at its core is run by a half-dead entity kept alive with daily human sacrifice. But there are no horrors in the galaxy greater than the embodiment of horror itself, the gods of chaos. And among them there is one who is mightier than the others, one who feeds off the ceaseless violence and death in the galaxy, who demands destruction, war, and bloodshed. Those who wage the forever wars that feed him know him as the Lord of Skulls, the Lord of Rage, the Blood God, Khorne. Today let us examine this entity of wrath and chaos, and the nature of sin. In the early days of mankind on the earth, rage and bloodshed were already a reality. When Cain first struck down his brother Abel, it is said that the motivation of that act was Khorne beginning the cycle of destruction and violence that would lead him to greater power. Khorne, along with the other chaos gods, feed off parts of the human condition, or otherwise if you're Xenos, and Khorne is the oldest and mightiest. Khorne feeds off of any source of conflict in the world, whether it be your own envy of someone with more money than you, or your rage at the person who inconvenienced you in traffic, or even our own political problems here in the States. All of these, and more severe things such as our desire to steal and of course to harm others, feed him. It is that last one Khorne feeds off of most, however. This brokenness of human nature, its fallen state and weakness, is what gives rise to such conflicts. And sin, despite how it is defined today and in much of the West, means quite literally to miss the mark. It is the arrow being shot to a target, but failing to hit the bullseye. This can be to greater and lesser degrees, but it is part of our fallen human nature, missing the mark of what is expected of us, which is virtue, humility, and a life in Christ. It is our very inability and unwillingness to do the things that are right that feeds the existence of this monstrosity. For conflict itself is the survival of one thing at the expense of another. But how are we to combat something so esoteric and pervasive, so seemingly omnipresent and eternal as rage and death? First, the philosophy of Khorne must be understood, that being that all is conflict, that there is no peace, only time wasted between battles. It is the belief that the essence of existence itself is conflict. But just like any other form of desire, Khorne has an insatiable desire for greater and greater conflict. Khorne does not simply feed off of small conflicts, he inflames the passions, driving people to greater and more irrational actions in the name of releasing their rage. For above all, Khorne seeks the spilling of blood. Anytime someone seeks prayer or help with taking a life, Khorne is there to claim the blood price. The soldier at war wishing only to obliterate his enemies pleases Khorne when his rage takes over and he takes the life of many on the battlefield. The scorned spouse who spills the blood of their other half as revenge for a slight pleases Khorne. But this pleasing of the Lord of Rage and Blood is actually an impossible task. It is completely temporary and fleeting. Primitive people often portray Khorne as a great beast. What better way to depict an entity whose very existence is a manifestation and embodiment of anger and bloodshed? This parasitic and disgusting way to view reality is really an ultimate portrayal of the philosophy of might makes right. There is no justification for the violence for those dedicated to Khorne. It is simply violence for the glory, as they call it. It is death for death's sake, only to futilely try to satiate a boundless abyss. To take what you desire, because by being able to do so, you are superior. A great example of this in the lore of Warhammer 40k is, of course, the World Eaters and old Angron himself, and most importantly, their use of the Butcher's Nails. We see in Angron and the World Eaters a consistent degradation of their humanity, until they became ravenous beasts and servants of Khorne. Angron was cast through the warp to the planet of Nuceria not long after his creation by the Emperor, where he quickly grew in size and prowess, being forced by cruel masters to fight in gladiator matches, often to the death against other people. If they fought well, he spared them. After enough time impressing the crowds and beating hundreds of opponents, he became known as the Lord of the Red Sands, and even the Unbeaten. Angron was also mentored as well during this time by an older gladiator named Eunomaus. They even fought a great battle together against great beasts. But after this victory together, the two were ordered to fight to the death, despite their deep bond. Angron refused. As a punishment, he was cursed with the Butcher's Nails, the implants being hammered into his skull and grafted onto his brain. They greatly would increase his production of adrenaline, and thus greatly increase his aggression and fierceness and strength in battle. But they also reduce cognitive function, making you act more like a rabid animal. When you feel rage, you feel euphoria from the implants, and all else is no longer enjoyable, only the rage. After being implanted with this truly barbaric technology, Angron was loosed on his closest friend and mentor, and tore Eunomaus to pieces. Angron being deeply grieved, he led a great slave rebellion, whipping up his fellow gladiators into a frenzy against their cruel masters. But as he was to do battle for their freedom, the God Emperor of Man took him from the battle, and he was forced to watch as his fellow gladiators were slaughtered. Though the Emperor said this served a much grander design, Angron would never forgive him for it. It would stay in his heart as a great source of rage and hatred, pushing him another step on this path. Angron would continue to degrade over time, and if he lived for long enough, the Butcher's Nails would cause enough degradation of his brain that he would eventually die. But he was ruled by this ever-increasing rage and obsession with blood, saying as much later, "Monuments are dust, tales merely words, soon forgotten, but blood is forever." But rage and bloodlust wasn't enough for just himself. He wanted this fire to spread to the hearts of his legion. He pushed volunteers, and even some by force, to receive the same implants that were driving him further into insanity. But all it resulted in was the deaths of everyone who received them. He even ran away at one point, becoming little more than a beast seeking to end his own misery. But it would never come. Later down the road, many of the World Eaters had survived the implanting of the Butcher's Nails, and now had the same crazed, frenzied behavior in battle that Angron did. And when a world was investigated and was found out to be using abominable intelligence, or AI, and modifying their forms, Angron went on to subjugate the world. If it wasn't done in the allotted time, well, then the World Eaters would be decimated. If you're at all familiar with Roman history, you'll know that this practice was that 1 out of every 10 members of the Legion would be slain by the other 9, hence the name, decimation. Despite the pleas of the inhabitants of the planet at one point, the World Eaters were too blinded by the Butcher's Nails and proceeded to massacre all of them. The entire native population of the planet was reduced to 0. This, of course, led to the Night of the Wolf. Leman Russ and the Space Wolves faced down the World Eaters, and without orders from their Primarchs, the Astartes fought each other. Both sides claimed victory, but one thing is for certain. Angron didn't answer for what he had done. and he only furthered his push for all Astartes in World Eater territory to have the horrible implants. But this history isn't just a lore dump. It's a great, even if exaggerated, example of what rage and resentment and love for spilling blood does to a person over time. Practices like seeing how many skulls they could take, or drinking blood, and even the vicious gladiator combat that Angron was once a slave to became commonplace among the World Eaters. Angron would even state during the Horus Heresy the upending of the entire Imperium into civil war and disaster, that he considered himself already dead, that he died a long time ago, and that he didn't care about who was in charge on Terra and of the Imperium. This is exactly what Khorne desires. This is a perfect example of what anger does. There are few sins that come to mind as more severe than breaking the commandment of not committing murder. It is one thing to do justice to protect the innocent. It is another thing entirely to spill blood for its own sake. If anything, me calling Angron a beast many times is an insult to beasts. At least they seek to feed themselves and to survive. The followers of Khorne do not care about survival. They don't care about their own necessities, but only about death. The worst people in history are often regarded as those who spent their days committing acts of violence just to satiate some sick desire. Those who follow Khorne are just like those people. Christ told us that we have heard that we should not kill, but he tells us that we shouldn't even feel hatred in our hearts against others, for we would have already committed the act in our hearts and minds, even if we haven't done it physically. What holding on to anger does is distort the human form. What is inside bleeds to the outside over time, and we become leprous and wretched. Much like any form of addiction, the more we hurt ourselves and don't heal, the harder it becomes to reverse the course we're on. Chaos is truly a fitting name for the ruinous powers. As order, discipline, humility, virtue, these are the things which produce real fruits. But it requires not picking up the rock to strike your brother down just because we are jealous and angry. Sin is a move toward nothingness and non-existence. It doesn't have its own existence. In the same way a lamp is turned on and permeates the space it is in, dispelling the darkness, so does goodness dispel evil. But evil itself doesn't exist. Darkness isn't a real or tangible thing. It only exists in relation to light. But light is real. It has a true existence. What could better exemplify working towards an abyss of nothingness than the taking of lives? The ending of new creation for the selfishness of the self. The attempt to satisfy the unsatisfiable desire of Khorne. Human desire is infinite, but the world itself is finite. This is what all who serve the blood god willingly experience. They only get fleeting feelings of success before it is once again replaced with the same desire they were already chasing. But the irony is that this is also true for Khorne himself. Were he to actually win the great game against the other Chaos Gods and conquer the entire universe, he would cease to exist. There would be no more wars, no more blood to flow. Eventually it would end. This goes for all of the Chaos Gods. And even in Khorne's own realm, the war is endless, the battles unending and completely without a purpose. The realm of chaos itself is called the Warp, a fitting name for what it does to all the worlds and peoples it consumes. And there is something to be said about its most mighty and old god, that while the other three require elaborate rituals and a certain philosophy to follow, Tzeentch with forbidden knowledge and sorcery, Slaanesh with excess and debasement, Nurgle with stagnation and the end of all pain. Khorne is the simplest. And it is often said of anger that it burns hot and dies fast. It is so quick and easy to become angry with someone, so quick and easy to act upon it. And Khorne himself pushes people to inflame the passions, to make them lose self-control, to make those rivers of blood flow so that he may sit atop his throne of skulls that can never be high enough for him to be satisfied, to worship death and torment and insatiability rather than work towards eternal life. The nature of sin is the service of the self over God, and the choosing of one's own way, and we must be cautious with ourselves and our conflicts. We must resolve our conflicts with our brothers before we approach the altar. We must fight continually in the heart, to excise these things from our lives, lest we turn to utter chaos and become like Angron, allowing our tortured past to become the reason we descend into madness. We must stand guard against our anger and hatred, and our desire to do harm, or else we will stand in the ranks of the demons before long. Angron himself became a literal monster working with demonic bloodthirsters, whose forms are covered in gore and blood, and whose visage invokes the depictions of demons. We must regain self-control and self-mastery, but above all, humility. If pride is the source of all sin, and as my patron saint Augustine of Hippo once said, that pride is a proud mother, then humility is the source of all virtue, as the others all require humility. Khorne and chaos are indicative of the deadly sins, which, if you didn't know, included more than just 7 in the medieval era, and, more importantly, are indicative of the evil one, that fallen angel, that accuser, that liar from his birth, Satan. I hope sincerely that through examining some of the lore of 40k, which is rich with an amazing world of an insane depth of information and storytelling, that those of you who have watched this have come to understand the nature of anger and hatred and violence a little better, and the ultimate logical end if we never turn away from it. I'll leave you with a quote from St. Moses the Ethiopian. "You fast, but Satan does not eat. You labor fervently, but Satan never sleeps. The only dimension with which you can outperform Satan is by acquiring humility, for Satan has no humility." In the same way, the ruinous powers never rest in their aims to destroy mankind and corrupt all life to become the ultimate power. But if people acquire humility, maybe, just maybe, they won't be turned into horrific abominations and servants of the most evil entities imaginable. But that's all for now. I hope you guys enjoyed my first video on Warhammer 40k. It's a series I've been fond of for many years, but I've never really delved too deep into it until recently, and that is very much with the help of a good friend of mine who also provided a lot of information and lore for this video. I hope you guys also enjoy the format of this series I'm starting with this video. I hope I can refine it more over time, but I want to tackle specific sins and issues of how we ought to live our lives using fictional examples. After all, that's really my goal with this entire channel. And what better place to start than the grimdark Warhammer 40k series, which features literal demons and an ultra-religious human empire in space. But with all that said, please do share this video if you enjoyed it, and leave a like and a comment. Subscribe for more content just like this, and make sure you don't miss all the videos I'll be working on this year. And, as always, until next time, God be with you.